The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 12th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. As Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. I wonder how many of you noticed the sermon title in the bulletin this morning and thought that maybe Katie had made a typographical error. Well, she didn't. It was exactly as I asked her to print it. It's a pun, of course, if you hadn't noticed. It's intended to be something more than just a play on words, however. It's intended as a way of introducing the theme of the sermon this morning. That the widow's mite, M-I-T-E, that's what we normally call her gift, her poverty, is her might, M-I-G-H-T, her strength. That is to say, by entrusting what little she had to God, this widow came to have something greater than the world could ever offer. The confidence of God's protection and care and love. And here's what I hope you'll get out of this sermon today. Whether you have just a little or a whole lot of material wealth, the more you entrust your life and your material wealth to God, the greater your experience will be of life in all of its abundance. So let's look for a minute at the context of our gospel reading. It takes place in the temple in Jerusalem, as we said with the kids. By far, that temple was the most magnificent building in the entire country at that time. And the temple was not only the spiritual center of Jewish religious life, but it was also the social center. It was like a marketplace where everyone came to share and sell their goods and wares. If you wanted a good time, you went to the temple where all the people were. Well, Mark tells us that Jesus and his disciples had been at this crowded, noisy temple all day. They were arguing with the religious big shots, the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They had been trying to trap him by asking questions such as, should a good Jew pay taxes to Caesar, that hated emperor, or not? Or if a woman marries 7 times, when she dies and goes to heaven, whose wife will she be? Fun questions, right? In addition to cleverly dodging their leading questions, Jesus, as he often did, used the occasion to teach those who were around him. And in the verse just prior to our text today, we read, "The large crowd was listening to him with delight." Most preachers and teachers would love having those words written about them. The large crowd was listening to him with delight. But that brings us to the first 3 verses of our lesson today, where Jesus tosses a zinger back at the scribes, his accusers. "Beware of the scribes," he says, "who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogue and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance they say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." That sort of sets the stage for what comes next. Now put yourself in Jesus' sandals. This back and forth with the scribes and Pharisees had been going on for days now, according to Mark, and Jesus was worn out. And so he came over and sat down, our text says. He sat down on the seat or the bench that was against the wall. You can imagine it was a little like what I do sometimes when I'm with Nova at the mall. You see a lot of men do this, I think. They look for the nearest bench to sit down and rest a while. And what do you do while you're sitting there? Well, I almost never have a good book to read, so I people watch. And that can be really fun and interesting, you know. You can find out a whole lot about people by looking at the message on their hats and their t-shirts. Now, I don't think that was true in Jesus' day, reading hats and t-shirts, I mean. But verse 41 of our text says that Jesus was people watching. Now, as I said to the kids, scholars tell us that in the outer court of the temple, there were 13 big wooden boxes where temple goers would place their offerings. And each of these boxes had a metal sort of trumpet-shaped receptacle at the top that would funnel the coins down into the boxes below. So use your imagination here for a moment and read between the lines. I'm guessing that Jesus noticed one of those scribes he had just been talking about come in dressed in purple and fine silk. The text says Jesus watched several rich people put money into the offering boxes. Well, this guy that came in, one of the scribes, just by looking at him, you know that he wanted to be looked at. One could tell that he was elegantly rich by the gold rings and the gold bracelets that he had on. And one could always tell a rich man by his shoes, you know. So this guy had on the best sandals you had ever seen. He pulled out 10 large silver coins that would make a large clank when he dropped them into that metal receptacle. He dropped them slowly and distinctly into the trumpet. Clank, 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 clank. All 10 of them. By the fourth clank, everybody was watching. Jesus nudged his friends, and they all smiled as they watched. Well, then this little old lady came in. She was almost invisible to the noisy, busy crowd. She was humped over. She was sort of wearing worn-out clothes with an old worn-out shawl around her shoulders. She was obviously very poor, looking like an old washerwoman. She was an old widow, walking very slowly, like her knees and her hips were filled with arthritis. She used a cane to support her on the granite floor as she approached the offering boxes. And into the box she dropped 2 tiny copper coins. We're told that each was not even half the size of our dime. And together they were worth only a penny. And Jesus whispered to his friends as they sat there on the bench, "Do you see that little old lady over there? She gave her last penny. Those other people gave out of their abundance. They had plenty to live on. But the old widow gave from the abundance of her heart. She gave everything she had, all that she had to live on." So the question for today is this: why was that widow so generous? Why was she such a generous giver? What was it that gave this widow her mite, M-I-G-H-T, when all she had to give was her mite, M-I-T-E? Well, let me suggest just a couple of qualities that I think she had that are the marks of a generous person. First, I believe that she knew her God. She had a personal relationship with God, I'm sure of that. I'm guessing she was involved with daily prayer and a daily walk with God. She didn't merely believe in the existence of God. Hers was a living relationship with God. In 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul describes the church in Macedonia. The church in Macedonia was a very generous church. Those Christians gave joyfully and excessively, Paul says. And then Paul asks the question, why? Why were they so generous with their money? And then he gives us the answer. He says they first gave themselves to the Lord. And so it was with this widow. She first gave herself to the Lord. I think you can't be a generous giver if you haven't given yourself to God first. That's what this widow did. It's why she was such a generous giver. She first gave herself to the Lord. The second reason why I believe that this widow was so generous was that she realized how abundantly generous God had been to her. She had experienced the generosity of God. Now, she may have experienced the good life in her earlier life. We don't know that. Nothing is said about her. That is, she might have been married. She might have had a husband that provided for her for many years before he died. She may have had a dozen children and 4 dozen grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. And she may have experienced the good life of a Jewish woman at one time in her life. Or, and I think this is probably more likely, her husband died when she was only 20 or 30 years old. Maybe she never had any children at all. Maybe her husband was very poor and left her nothing to live on. In biblical days, widows occupied one of the lowest rungs on the social ladder. They lived at the mercy of others. They had no power, they had no position, no prominence in the community. They depended on others to protect them and to provide for their needs. And this is why over and over again the Bible urges God's followers to care for widows. But in either situation, whether she had once experienced the good life or not, this widow still felt a sense of gratitude toward God. She knew that everything she had, that wasn't much in the eyes of the world. Everything she had was a gift. People of faith, like this widow, know that. They know that everything is a gift. Our abilities with which we make our money, our brains, our work habits, our health, our good fortune, all of it's a gift. If you're a generous giver, you know that to be true deep down in your inner person. It's all a gift from God. I don't have to preach a lot these days since I've retired. So when I do have a chance to fill in for someone, I usually have a few weeks to reflect on the text. Brian called me about 3 weeks ago, so I've had about 3 weeks to discover in my own thinking how these lessons relate to my life. And so it occurred to me in my reflection time about this text that I've spent a lot of money over the years. I've spent money paying bills, buying clothes, going out to eat. For the most part, I don't have anything to show for it except stuff. Nova and I give away a lot of clothes to Goodwill each year, and we still have more than we need. I'm sure we've traded cars more than 15 times in the 47 years we've been married. But the money that I've given to the church's mission, to help feed someone who is hungry, or to help fund a water well in rural Africa where children die of contaminated water, or when we help a child through Compassion International grow in faith, give that child the opportunity for a college education. These are the gifts that continually make my heart feel good and put a smile on my face. Over and over again these past couple of weeks, this thought kept coming back to me that in the end, the only treasures that you get to keep are those that you give away. You know, if you're smart, you can amass a fortune in stocks and bonds and real estate. Some people do that. But you can't take any of that with you. When you're gone, the government's going to get its share, and Your kids are going to split up the rest. And furthermore, even when you're alive, your riches aren't going to bring you the lasting happiness that you thought they would. But the things you give away, in a sense, you're going to keep forever. The joy of knowing that folks are blessed by your generosity and their lives are better as a result. And you know, that thought was amplified for me just a little over a week ago when Nova and I went to an Oak Ridge Boys concert. I don't know if any of you have heard the Oak Ridge Boys. Even though they're old guys right now, they still put on a pretty good show. One of the songs that they sang was a song that was included on one of their albums more than a dozen years ago. It's called "Did I Make a Difference?" I didn't remember the song at all, but when I heard it, I really liked it a lot. And part of the lyrics go like this: I've been working hard to make a living and forgetting what true living is. Taking more than giving. Something's missing. Lord, how long can I go on like this? Did I make a difference in somebody's life? What hurts did I heal? What wrongs did I right? Did I raise my voice in defense of the truth? Did I lend my hand to the destitute? When my race is run, when my song is sung, will I have to wonder, did I make a difference? Did I make a difference? The widow gave everything she had, and in so doing laid claim to everything that God had to offer. She became a part of something greater than herself, and that was the kingdom of God. And as such, she walked away with something more than those who still had money in their pockets. Her might was her might. Her devotion to God, the source of her strength and self-respect. You and I need to remember this, that when we give, not out of our abundance, but out of the faith that's in our hearts, God's going to bless us in ways far greater than you and I can ever imagine. And what's more, we're going to have treasures in heaven. Amen.